Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, or audio reviews in this case, because I'm talking today about the Beyerdynamic T5 and T1 third generation. Because these headphones share so many similarities, what I thought I'd do was start with all of the things that are the same and then diverge into talking about each one on its own from a sound quality perspective. So if you're looking for a review on both of these, what you'll need to do is watch this one and then jump over to the other one and use the chapter markers in the timeline or the description to jump ahead to the parts that are different. These are headphones that have had a lot of fans, but also a lot of detractors over the years. So I was really interested to see how the new version stacked up to my memory of the original T1s and indeed to other flagship headphones on the market today. Before we jump into the review, I just want to flag that these headphones retail for about 1,600 Australian dollars, which equates to roughly 11 to 1,200 US dollars. And that's pretty cheap these days for a flagship headphone. So the question for me as I got my hands on these was whether or not they're really good value for money, being a flagship headphone at that price, or whether they're actually more of a moderate performance headphone that just happens to be at the top of Beyerdynamic's range. The T1 and the T5 retail here in Australia for about 1,600 Australian dollars, which equates to around 11 to 1,200 US dollars. Unlike previous iterations, they now have an impedance of just 32 ohms and a sensitivity of about 100 decibels. So what that means is that they no longer require, in the case of the T1 in particular, the really high voltage amplifiers to get the most out of them. In fact, these are now very non-power hungry headphones. To put that in perspective, both of these headphones only require about 100 to 120 milliwatts to get dangerously loud levels of sound out of them. That equates to an amplifier's output voltage needing to be no more than about 2 volts and about 60 milliamps. So that means you're going to be able to get the most out of these in terms of giving them enough power from something as simple as a portable digital audio player or something like an AudioQuest Dragonfly. All of those will be absolutely fine with both the T1 and the T5. Obviously, better quality sources will sound better because it's not just about the amount of power available, but the point here is that both of them don't need a lot of power, so you can focus more on the quality of the source, not how powerful it is. Let's start talking a bit about the accessories and the design of both headphones. Most of this is pretty similar between both headphones, so we'll start this section together before diverging into the sound quality. Both headphones ship with this really nice carry case. It's got like a velour, velvety sort of outer with the Beyerdynamic logo, and you can see from how I'm holding it here, it's pretty cavernous. There's lots of space there, so it's going to take either headphone plus the cable rolled up safely inside it. It's not a small case at all, so I doubt people are going to be throwing this in their work bag, but certainly if you had professional needs for transporting your headphone around, it's nice to have a big case like this that's going to thoroughly protect your expensive headphones. Other than the carry case, when you buy either headphone, all you're getting is the headphone itself and a cable. In the case of the T1, it's a longer cable than the T5, and that's probably because the T1 is likely to be a desktop headphone. Being an open headphone, it doesn't isolate well, so there's a good chance that it's always going to be attached to a desktop amplifier. The T5, on the other hand, has a much more manageable, shorter cable that could easily be used walking around the house, commuting, in an office, you name it. The cables themselves are the same design other than length, and that means that they're terminated in a 3.5mm headphone jack, like so, and they come with a 6.3mm adapter. I do think it's a shame that you're not getting balanced connections at a flagship level like this, but at least it's a detachable cable that you can get an upgrade for if you want to. And speaking of an upgrade, you're going to want an upgraded cable the moment you buy these. Not because the cable's bad quality in terms of its sound, it feels good, it looks good, the connections are all sturdy and stable. The problem is it's wrapped in this coarse fabric. And whenever you're wearing the headphones, they produce the most horrendous amount of microphonic sound back through the cable that it really gets in the way of enjoying the music. I think Beyerdynamic have made an absolute blunder on this cable, and I really recommend anyone looking at these to go out and get a replacement cable immediately, because I just don't think you're going to be able to enjoy it. Speaking of the cable, the headphones themselves have the cable entries in the bottom here, but angled forward. Not majorly forward, so they're not coming straight out at you, but at a slight angle. And that's nice because it means the cable's not coming down, draping over your shoulder. And if you're putting it on a headphone stand, the cable's not going straight down into the desk, but coming out at a slight angle. Much more gentle on the cable and also more comfortable for you when you're wearing it. While we're talking headphone design, both of these models use the very familiar Beyerdynamic design language, which means it's got a simple round cup. It's got pads made of either leather in the case of the T5 or velour in the case of the T1, both of which are very, very comfortable. The drivers on the inside are slightly angled towards your ear, and that helps with a sense of space and soundstage from the headphones. But interestingly, Beyerdynamic have implemented this funny sort of foam pad or mesh pad over the top of the driver. It's similar to something I noticed in the DT880s that I reviewed recently, where they're putting this extra layer of padding over the top of the driver that is probably based on a reduction in the treble output. I'll talk about that more when we get to sound quality, but it makes the inside of the cup quite nice and sleek to look at. And if your ears do happen to touch anything inside the cup, which mine haven't by the way, so I'm not suggesting that's a problem, but if they do happen to touch anything in there, it's all very soft and comfortable. Back to the outside of the headphones, we've got the yokes here, which are made again of metal like you'd be used to from the original T1s and T5s. And then you've got a leather-clad headband with this nice sort of Alcantara top piece there with the Beyerdynamic logo. So it's all very nicely put together. It feels luxurious, everything's quite comfortable, and they feel like a proper flagship headphone. A couple of final points I want to mention though is that I did find a little bit of a hotspot happening as I wore both the T5 and the T1 for any extended period. I'd just get a little patch on top of my head that would get uncomfortable, and I'd need to shift the headphone band back or forth a little bit. So it's a minor issue, but I don't find that happening with a lot of my other flagship headphones that I can easily wear for hours at a time. With these, 1 hour to 2 hours, somewhere in that window, I was finding myself a little bit uncomfortable just on top of the head. If you've got hair, unlike me, you're probably not going to have that problem, but for those baldies like me out there, it may be an issue. Another design piece I wanted to talk about was that on the T1s over here, we've got this interesting architecturally inspired hole pattern. So instead of the old-fashioned mesh grid, what they've actually got here now is a series of punched holes of slightly different sizes. It's quite a nice geometric pattern. In the case of the T1, it makes sense. I think it looks really sleek and I like the design. Where my problem comes up, and this is purely personal preference, I don't really understand why they felt the need to transfer the same pattern as a printed pattern onto the T5. I actually think it cheapens the look of the headphone. It's unnecessary detailing that generally I think we see on cheaper stuff, whereas if we just had a really nice matte brushed finish, these could have looked spectacular. Now, as I said, some people are going to love the way they've done this. I believe the pattern's been made with a brushing treatment, so it's not actually printed or painted on as I might have just suggested. It's in the actual metal finish itself by the look of it, and so it all depends on how it's reflecting light, whether it looks darker or lighter than the rest of the cup. Either way, I'm not personally a fan, but it is entirely personal preference. You might love it, and it's not a reason to not buy these if you like the sound of them. The only other thing I'll mention while I've got the T5s in hand, before we diverge this into separate reviews for the T1 and T5 sound quality, is that the T5s isolate really well, whereas as you'd expect from the open T1s, they don't really isolate at all. So if isolation is important to you, obviously the T5s are the ones to look at, but actually the decision-making process between these two could easily be more about the sound, because they don't sound as similar as you might think. As you probably guessed, that marks the moment where we split ways, and now we'll talk about the sound quality for the T1 and the T5 separately. Don't forget you can always jump over to the other review if you do want to hear about both of them.
And what you lost, and what you had, and what you lost.
The T5s being the closed variant of the T1 don't try to mimic the T1 sound, but offer an entire flavour of their own, and I'm so glad that they did. If you've watched my review of the T1, you'll know that I really didn't find them that satisfying. The sound was underwhelming, it was tuned back from the T1's original bright and energetic days, but didn't really find a sweet spot anywhere. On the flip side, the T5s absolutely have a sweet spot, and I'm really pleased to say that these are a brilliant headphone in my opinion. They're not perfect, there are going to be people out there that hate them, but I think they've got a real sweet spot for some people that enjoy the type of sound that I'm about to describe. The words I've written down in my notes for the T5 are things like smooth, rich and seductive. They're an immediately enjoyable, relaxing and engaging listening experience. Which doesn't mean you should think that they're smoothing off details or they're muddying things up. They're definitely not. They're just presenting it in this really beautiful, rich and liquid presentation. Having said that, don't think of these as detail-oriented analytical tools. Instead, think of these as headphones that you'll put on, you'll let the world disappear, and you'll just enjoy your tunes in comfort and relaxation. One of the most impressive things about the T5s, particularly being a closed headphone, is they do produce a really excellent sense of space. Like the T1, they have this lovely soundstage that's three-dimensional, open and spacious, not quite as big as the T1 probably in the T5's case, but still a really great sense of space, particularly for a closed headphone. One of the things that really stood out to me with the T5s was that I wasn't drawn into thinking about the bass, mid and treble separately because the sound signature is really nicely tuned, so everything sits really well balanced within the mix. There's no doubt though that the T5s are going to be considered a rolled off headphone to a lot of people. The treble is much pulled back compared to something like the T1, and that's part of creating the smooth experience. As a comparison, and to put this in perspective, I put the T5s up against the AudioQuest NightOwls. I'm a huge fan of the Nighthawk and the NightOwl. They're actually over behind me here, you can't see them behind my chair, but they're a headphone that's stayed in my collection since day one. The NightOwl, when it was available, was about half the price of the T5 right now, and so it's not entirely a fair comparison, but I always felt like the NightOwl punched above its weight anyway. On top of that, I don't have very many closed headphones, so it's the best comparison I have here and now. Speaking of comparisons, let me take a sidestep for a second. I've had a number of people post on reviews lately asking for specific comparisons or suggesting that I should rank everything next to each other, and I just wanted to point out that with a small channel like this one, it's very hard to have all that gear on hand because in most cases I'm buying the gear myself, or I might have it on loan for 3 or 4 weeks from a manufacturer or a retailer. That makes it very difficult to do detailed comparisons because a lot of it ends up being from memory, and that's not fair to anyone because it's not going to be accurate. So the reason I raise this is not to have a rant or complain, but to say that I would love to provide those sorts of comparisons, and therefore what I'd ask from you is that if you're not already a subscriber, do hit that subscribe button because it helps me grow the channel, which will help me accumulate more gear and therefore be able to provide you with better content. If you'd like to take that even a step further, have a look at the links down below using the affiliate links through to Amazon or Apos Audio or coming over and joining the Patreon page. All of those things make a huge difference to my ability to produce better content for you. So please have a think about that. If you don't, that's totally okay, but I just wanted to raise it because I know a lot of people want comparisons and I'd love to provide them too. Back now to the T5, let's talk about the comparison with the NightOwl. Jumping between the two, the NightOwl has a better sense of clarity and texture to its sound. But realistically, one of the first things I wrote down was that both of these are exceptional closed headphones. They're really good, they're just different. The T5 had a significantly larger soundstage, and that's something I really enjoy, so having that in a closed headphone is a real bonus. The T5 is also significantly smoother and warmer, and that's compared to a headphone in the NightOwl that is already not the brightest headphone around. So what that says to me is that some people are really not going to enjoy how warm and lush the sound from the T5 is, but I would encourage people to take a listen if that's something that you don't mind. These do it really well. If you've heard a poor example of a rich, lush headphone in the past, you may feel like that leads to a lack of detail and a muddiness to the sound, that everything kind of blends together. But what I can say is in the case of the T5, it's absolutely not the case. Obviously treble details aren't first and foremost in what you hear, but at the same time I didn't once feel with the T5s that I was missing anything in the experience. One of the key features of the T5 sound is that its bass has more impact and presence than something like the NightOwl, and indeed also more than something like its brother the T1. The extra presence in the T5's bass may lead some people to feel like it's overdone a little bit and it's getting a bit too full, but I personally really enjoyed it and I didn't feel like it was getting really loose. It's just got a lot of presence and a good amount of weight. As is normally the case when you get that level of presence in bass, it does create the sense that it's not as quick in the bass, but I didn't ever feel like the bass was breaking up or getting too loose in the case of the T5s. Ultimately, I would say that having listened to both the T5 and the NightOwl, I would happily have both, but right now, if I had to pick up one or the other to have a listen, I'd be seduced by the sound of the T5 and go for that. It's so thoroughly enjoyable. The holographic sense of soundstage that it produces is really, really engaging and immersive for the music. So personally for me, I think the T5 is a great headphone. It's by far and away the better headphone of the T1 and the T5 in my opinion, not because it's going to be perfect for everybody, but because it's like the engineers for the T5s, and they may be the same as the T1 engineers, I'm not sure, but those tuning the T5 really pushed it into a sweet spot and did it really well. Whereas I felt like the T1s, as I said in my review of those, kind of were being tamed from where they used to be, but never found what they are now. They didn't have an identity. The T5 has an identity. It's not going to be for everybody, but if you like that rich, warm sound, but still very detailed, they're a fantastic headphone. And indeed for me, whilst I'm not a huge user of closed headphones, I have had a fair few over the years, and these are right up there with the NightOwls as the best I've heard to date. Hopefully you found this review useful. If you did, please do think about hitting the subscribe button and the like button. It really helps the channel to grow, helps me to bring you better content, more comparisons, etc. And don't forget about the affiliate links, my merchandise, and the Patreon page that are all linked below as other ways you can support the channel and help me bring better content to you. For now though, I just want to say thanks to Beyerdynamic's Australian distributors for the loan of the T1 and the T5. I hope you found these reviews enjoyable. Happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.